Max Verstappen is still the fastest driver on the grid. That part has not changed, but something else has. Something almost no one inside Formula One wants to say out loud. Because for the first time in years, there is a gap. Not in speed, not in talent, but between what Verstappen is capable of and what his car is actually giving him. And recently you could see it, not in one dramatic failure, not in a crash, but in small moments, slight hesitation on corner exits, radio messages that sounded just a little more tense than usual. And then the one thing that really caught people off guard, Verstappen finally responded, not with anger, not with excuses, but with something far more telling, frustration that felt controlled, measured, almost like he knew something deeper was going on. So here's the question no one can ignore anymore. Why is the most dominant driver of this generation starting to lose patience in 2026? Because on paper, everything should still be working. Red Bull built a dynasty. Verstappen turned that dynasty into dominance. And yet, right now, there's a quiet tension building under the surface. And if you watch closely, it does not look like a normal dip in form. It looks like something structural, something that could change everything. But to understand why this moment matters, you need to zoom out because this is not just about one race or one bad weekend. This is about what happens when the best driver in the world starts feeling the limits of the system around him. And once you see where Red Bull really stands right now, the situation becomes a lot more serious than it first appears. Because for years, Verstappen was not just winning, he was controlling races in a way that made the entire field look predictable. From the moment he joined Red Bull Racing as a teenager, everything about his trajectory pointed upward. Aggressive but precise, fast but calculated, and over time, that raw talent turned into something much more dangerous. Consistency at a level almost no one else could match. There were races where he did not just win, he disappeared, built gaps of seconds per lap, managed tires like a machine, executed strategies that left rival teams reacting instead of competing. For casual fans, it almost felt inevitable. If Verstappen was on the grid, he was the favorite. That was the baseline. And that is exactly why what is happening now feels different. Because dominance creates expectations, and expectations make even small cracks look massive. The 2026 regulation shift was always going to change things. New engine dynamics, different aerodynamic balance, a complete reset in how teams approach performance. Everyone knew it would shake the grid, but Red Bull was supposed to be ready. They had the data, the infrastructure, the driver who could adapt faster than anyone else. Yet, instead of extending their advantage, something strange started to happen. The pace became inconsistent. Some sessions looked untouchable, others looked vulnerable, not slow, but not in control, and that distinction matters. Because in Formula One, the difference between winning and losing is not always raw speed. It is predictability, knowing exactly how the car will behave every single lap. And right now, that certainty seems to be fading. You can hear it in the tone of team communications. You can see it in how aggressively Verstappen is pushing in situations where he normally would not need to. And most importantly, you can feel it in how the competition's reacting. Drivers who used to chase are now starting to challenge. Teams that once played safe are now taking risks because for the first time in a long time, the gap does not feel permanent. It feels reachable, and that changes everything because when the field believes they have a chance, the pressure multiplies. Every mistake matters more, every decision carries weight. And suddenly, the system that once worked perfectly starts showing stress points. If you're still here, it probably means you can feel it too. That something about this season does not quite line up with what we expected. And that is exactly why the next part of this story gets a lot more uncomfortable. Because once you start breaking down what has actually been happening on track, a pattern begins to emerge, and it is not a simple one. If you look at the last few race weekends closely, the story is not about a single mistake. It is about a pattern that should not exist for a driver like Max Verstappen. Lap 1 looks clean, Sector 1 is strong, then somewhere in Sector 2 or 3 something changes. Not a huge loss, maybe a tenth, maybe two, but it happens again and again and again. Now here's where it gets interesting. In previous seasons, when Verstappen found a rhythm, he would lock into it. Lap after lap, almost identical. That was his advantage. Precision, control, the feeling that the car was an extension of him. But now there are moments where that rhythm breaks. Not completely, just enough to raise a question. Why is he having to fight the car mid lap? Small steering corrections on corner exit, slight instability under traction, moments where he has to catch the rear earlier than expected. These are not mistakes, these are compensations. And once you start noticing that, the entire picture changes. Because then you go back to the data, sector times, tire degradation patterns, consistency across stints, and something becomes clear. The performance is still there, but it is not coming easily. Take one of the recent races as an example. Early laps, Verstappen pulls a gap. Everything looks normal. Then the tires settle, the fuel load changes, and suddenly the advantage shrinks. Not because he slows down, but because the car stops giving him the same feedback, and that forces him to push harder. But pushing harder in Formula One is not linear. You do not just gain time, you increase risk. So now you have a situation where the fastest driver on the grid is driving closer to the limit than he used to. Not by choice, but because he has to. And that is where the tension builds because every lap becomes a negotiation between what the car wants to do and what Verstappen needs it to do. And when those two things stop aligning perfectly, even slightly, the entire system starts to feel unstable. You can hear it in the radio: shorter answers, less certainty, more adjustments. What about the front end? What about the balance in high speed? What about traction out of slow corners? These are not random questions, they are signals, signals that something underneath the surface is not behaving the way it used to. And it is not just one race. Across multiple weekends, similar patterns show up. Strong qualifying, controlled opening stints, then a phase where things become harder to manage. And each time, Verstappen finds a way to still extract performance, still stay competitive, still look fast enough, but the effort level is different, and that raises a deeper question. If he's still delivering results, how much is he covering up? They see finishing positions, podiums, wins, but they do not see how much work it takes to get there. And when that workload increases, something has to give eventually. Now, layer on top of that the technical side. The 2026 regulations were not just a small adjustment, they fundamentally changed how teams balance power unit efficiency with aerodynamic stability. Red Bull built their success on a very specific philosophy: stable rear, predictable front, a platform that allowed Verstappen to attack corners with confidence. But if that platform becomes even slightly inconsistent, everything shifts, and suddenly the strengths that once made the car dominant become harder to access. There are early signs that the integration between the chassis and the new power unit concepts is not perfectly aligned yet. Not broken, but not seamless, and in Formula One, that difference is everything because a car does not need to be slow to feel difficult. It just needs to be unpredictable, and unpredictability is the one thing elite drivers hate the most because it removes control. And control is what Verstappen built his entire dominance on. So now imagine being in that cockpit. You know you are faster, you know the potential is there, but every lap you have to adjust. React, correct. That is exhausting. And over time, that starts to show, not in dramatic failures, but in subtle frustration in the way he talks, in the way he approaches certain situations. And that is why his recent response matters more than it seems, because it was not emotional, it was calculated, almost like he was choosing his words carefully, not to complain, but to signal something. And if you read between the lines, it becomes clear this is not about one bad race. It is about a system that is no longer perfectly in sync. But here's where everything flips. Because what if all of this it is not actually a weakness? On the surface, is actually hiding something much more impressive underneath. You cannot unsee it. Right here is where most people start to look at the situation differently. Because if the car is not giving him everything and he is still performing at this level, then the real story is not the car. It is what he's doing with it. And this is where I want to hear what you think. Do you believe Verstappen is actually struggling this season, or is he carrying more than we realize? Drop your take below because the next part might completely change how you see his performance. Because the truth is, he might not be the problem at all. If the car is not perfectly stable, the data will show it. And when you line up the numbers from recent races, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Start with consistency. Across multiple stints, Max Verstappen is still delivering lap times that cluster tighter than almost anyone else on the grid. But here's the detail that matters. The variation inside those clusters is slightly wider than what we saw during peak Red Bull dominance. Not by a lot, just enough, and in Formula One, just enough is everything. Because when you compare his telemetry traces to his closest rivals, something stands out. On entry, the car still rotates sharply, mid corner, it holds. But on exit, there are micro corrections, tiny adjustments in throttle application, small steering inputs that were not there before. Those are not inefficiencies, they are interventions. He is actively managing behavior that used to be passive. Now look at tire life. In previous seasons, Verstappen could extend stints without losing pace. That was part of the advantage. He could control degradation while still building a gap. Now, there are moments where the pace drop comes earlier than expected. Not dramatic, but noticeable when you overlay the laps. So, what does he do? He compensates, pushes harder in earlier phases, builds margin before the drop, adjusts his driving to stay ahead of the curve. And that leads to something even more telling. When you compare him to teammates or even top rivals, there are phases of the race where the car looks average, and then suddenly Verstappen extracts a lap that should not exist. That is the key. Those outlier laps are not random, they're signals. Signals that the performance ceiling of the car is higher than what it consistently delivers. And he is the one bridging that gap, which brings us back to the original question. Is this chaos really about Red Bull losing performance? Or is it about Verstappen operating beyond what the system was designed for? Because when a driver starts exceeding the natural balance of the car, something interesting happens. The margin for error disappears, every input becomes critical, every correction becomes necessary, and the difference between control and instability becomes razor thin. That is what overdriving actually looks like. Not reckless, not desperate, but precise and relentless. Pushing the car into a window it does not comfortably sit in, and if you go back through race footage with that lens, everything changes. Those small corrections are no longer mistakes, they are solutions. Those slight inconsistencies are no longer weaknesses, they are the cost of extracting maximum performance. And suddenly the narrative flips because now you're not watching a dominant driver struggle, you're watching a dominant driver compensate. And once you understand that, the frustration makes sense because there's a limit to how long that can work. No driver, no matter how good, can continuously operate beyond the natural behavior of the car without consequences. Fatigue builds, risk increases, one misjudgment, one moment where the balance shifts too far, and the result changes instantly. That is the edge he is living on right now. And that is why his response matters. It was not about one race, it was about sustainability, because deep down, he knows something the standings do not show yet. If the system does not realign, the performance gap he is currently covering will eventually become visible. And when it does, it will not look gradual, it will look sudden. So, what does this mean going forward? For Red Bull, it means the pressure is no longer just about being fast. It is about being consistent again, rebuilding that predictable platform that allowed Verstappen to operate with confidence instead of correction. For the rest of the grid, it means opportunity, because if the gap is being maintained by the driver rather than the machine, then it's not as secure as it looks. And in a season defined by regulation shifts and uncertainty, that is all rivals need. But for Verstappen himself, this might be the most important phase of his career. Not because he's losing, but because he's being tested in a different way. Not by competition alone, but by the limits of the system around him. And that's a very different challenge because dominance is easy to recognize when everything works. Greatness shows up when it does not. So the next time you watch him on track, do not just look at the result. Watch the details, watch the corrections, watch the exits, watch how often he has to adapt within a single lap, because that is where the real story is happening. And the biggest question now is not whether he can keep doing it. It is how long, because if this continues, something will have to change. Either the car catches up to him or the tension we are seeing right now becomes something much bigger. And if you want to see how that plays out, and whether this hidden struggle turns into a full shift in Formula One power, make sure you stay with this series because the answer to that question is coming sooner than most people think.